Climate-induced hunger, the vicious cycle of climate change, agriculture, and global food insecurity and its ethical ramifications. Introduction. Climate change is no longer a ticking bomb. It is exploding before our eyes. For years, discussions around climate change have designated global rises in temperature and alterations of weather patterns as problems for the future. And rarely have conversations regarding the connection between climate change and food insecurity been at the forefront of public discourse. However, the impacts of climate change on global hunger are being increasingly felt today, especially by the world's most vulnerable populations. Climate change is fueling food insecurity within low-income nations of the global south that are more exposed to, more susceptible to, and less equipped to endure its disastrous effects on food systems. While many assume that changes in global climate will be equally felt by all of Earth's inhabitants, the cyclical, poverty-reinforcing impact of climate change will exacerbate existing across-country inequalities and food insecurity. These unequal rises in rates of food insecurity pose a grievous threat to human dignity and demand the necessity of justice-promoting action from the world's wealthy nations. Defining terms. The United Nations defines climate change as long-term shifts in temperature and weather patterns that are driven by human emission of greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide or methane. These greenhouse gases trap heat within Earth's atmosphere, effectively warming the planet and stimulating climate change. Currently, atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations are at their highest levels in 2 million years, and the Earth is about 1.1 degrees Celsius warmer than it was at the end of the 19th century. The consequences of climate change are various, including increased temperatures, intense droughts, water scarcity, forest fires, rising sea levels, flooding, catastrophic weather events, and declining biodiversity, all of which have the potential to severely disrupt global food systems. Food insecurity is defined as a lack of regular access to safe, nutritious food in a quantity that is adequate for growth, development, and a healthy lifestyle. When an individual encounters severe food insecurity and is incapable of acquiring food for consumption, they can also be experiencing hunger, which is the painful physical sensation that results from insufficient dietary energy intake. Hunger interferes with an individual's capability to lead a normal, active, and healthy life, and can result in undernourishment. The USDA reports that rates of food insecurity are highest among low-income nations. In 2014, about 50% of people in low-income countries experienced food insecurity, compared with only 10% in high-income nations. Climate change and food insecurity are strongly linked. Currently, climate change is deepening food insecurity in 10 of the world's worst climate hotspots, those countries with the highest number of extreme weather-related appeals to the United Nations. As of September 2022, 48 million people across the countries of Afghanistan, Burkina Faso, Djibouti, Guatemala, Haiti, Kenya, Madagascar, Niger, Somalia, and Zimbabwe were experiencing food insecurity. This number has risen by 123% over the past 6 years. As climate change continues to intensify, so too will food insecurity. A framework for the discussion of climate change and poverty-related issues. The relationship between climate change and poverty is one characterized by an inequality-aggravating cycle in which existing inequities cause disadvantaged groups to suffer disproportionately from the negative effects of climate change, resulting in increased subsequent inequality. When it comes to climate change, the people that feel it the most are the people that have the least. The United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs outlines 3 channels through which climate change exerts significant influence on existing issues related to poverty and inequality. While this framework was designed to address the relationship between climate change and previously existing within-country inequalities, it is also applicable in understanding the relationship between climate change and international inequalities. According to the UN, disadvantaged countries experience an increase in exposure to the impacts of climate change, an increase in susceptibility to damage caused by climate change, and a decrease in the ability to recover from damages incurred. This framework can be utilized in understanding the cyclical manner in which climate change exacerbates and stimulates food insecurity within the global south, countries with the highest rates of existing food insecurity. Application of framework. First, developing nations are at an increased level of exposure to the adverse effects of climate change, making it significantly more difficult for farmers to successfully grow food and for people to attain food. Both geographic proximity to the equator and location within aridity zones place many low-income individuals at an increased exposure to drought, heat wave, and water scarcity, all of which significantly impede upon a region's agricultural ability. Considering the 2010 GDP PPP per capita, most of the world's poorest individuals live at low latitudes. Due to this equatorial location, many developing countries with previously existing food insecurity have a predisposition toward lower rates of internal temperature variability, making these nations more inclined to higher frequencies of the occurrence of temperature extremes, which are prompted by climate change. These nations are also more vulnerable to extreme weather events. In 2017, more than 80% of those experiencing food insecurity lived in countries prone to increased natural hazards resulting from climate change. Drastic deviations in standard temperatures and increased exposure to weather events both severely impede upon a region's ability to successfully plant, grow, and harvest crops that serve as primary food sources for much of the area's inhabitants. Second, the agriculturally based economic disposition and specific farming practices of many developing nations places them at a greater susceptibility to increased food insecurity. In many of such countries, agriculture accounts for a disproportionately large percentage of the nation's GDP, employs large portions of the population, and usually occurs in the form of smallholding farms that rely on crop generation as a principal source of income. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, around 1/3 of the world's food is produced by smallholding farms, consisting of less than 2 hectares of land. They also report that farm size tends to increase with average national income levels. Unlike the large industrial agricultural complexes of wealthy nations, low-income countries often depend upon subsistent smallholding farms as their foremost source of food. These farmers rely heavily on region-specific precipitation patterns and temperature ranges that are being increasingly disrupted by climate change. With rising temperatures comes a decrease in crop yields. Even subtle temperature increases, such as those between 1 and 2 degrees Celsius, can negatively impact the yields of rice, maize, and wheat. Some projections suggest that the effects of climate change could result in a decrease of around 10% of aggregate yields of maize in smallholder farms in both Africa and Latin America by 2055. Not only does climate change lead to a decrease in the quantity of food, but it also severely diminishes its quality. Increased atmospheric CO2 has been linked to a decline in the nutritional content of essential crops. Researchers at the Harvard Chan School found that when cereal crops such as rice, maize, or wheat are exposed to high levels of carbon dioxide, they lose as much as 10% of their zinc, 5% of their iron, and 8% of their protein content. These decreases in crop quantity and quality will both negatively impact the economic position of farmers and deprive the community of food and nutrients usually acquired from such agricultural outlets. In nations with structural dependencies on smallholding agriculture, these effects are especially detrimental to the food security of the region. Finally, low-income nations often lack the sufficient ability to both economically endure and recover from the disadvantageous effects of climate change on agriculture and food production, disproportionately augmenting rates of food insecurity within the regions. As food becomes increasingly less available and disruptions to the food system become more frequent, prices will inevitably rise. On average, impoverished households in the global south devote 62% of their incomes to food, while the percentage of income spent on food expenses for non-poor households is around 44%. Since expenditure on food comprises a larger share of the budgets of low-income households, increased food prices will result in more severe reductions in already limited dispensable incomes and substantial increases in food insecurity. In fact, rising food prices in 2021 were a major factor in pushing approximately 30 million additional people in low-income countries toward food insecurity. The subsistence-centric farming organization of many low-income nations also means a lack of access to modern agricultural technologies available to wealthier nations. While high-income countries with commercial agricultural networks will possess the ability to combat the negative impacts of climate on crop yields through genetic engineering, irrigation systems, and on-farm soil erosion control adaptations, such luxuries will not be available and accessible to lower-income countries. With limited reliable means of coping with resources scarcity and increased economic deprivation due to inflated food costs, low-income countries may be disposed to the dangers of conflict and competition. There exists a significant link between climate change, food insecurity, and increased levels of violence. Researchers have identified a reliable connection between the occurrence of droughts, which have been increasingly severe as a result of climate change, the subsequent decline in food availability, and the rise of rebel attack on civilians. Some studies have proposed that diminishing rates of agricultural production and increased food scarcity due to climate change may result in increases in the prevalence of civil wars in nations most vulnerable to climate change by more than 50% by the mid-21st century. Ethical considerations in international policy. When considering the morality of the influence of climate change on food insecurity, it is important to differentiate between the ethical objections to food insecurity alone and the amplified ethical concerns of culpability and responsibility for amending increased food insecurity that results from climate change. In 1948, the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights designated the right to food as a critical component to the right to an adequate standard of living. This proclamation classified food and freedom from hunger to be a human right and marked the emergence of an international prioritization of policies that promote and encourage food accessibility. The United Nations subsequently defines a human right as those that are inherent to all human beings, regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or other status. As the sole end to the fulfillment of a basic biological need, food acquisition is foundational to the preservation of the dignity of the human person, and thus the denial of adequate and nutritious food is an egregious violation of a human right. This designation raises the question of whether wealthier nations have a duty to provide aid to countries with high rates of domestic food insecurity. Ethicist Peter Singer argues that humans have a moral obligation to assist those experiencing poverty whenever one possesses the ability to do so without substantial personal sacrifice. Singer would argue that neglecting to prevent the hunger-induced suffering of another, when one has the ability to do so, is a grave moral wrong, equivalent to failing to save a drowning child out of fear of ruining one's new shoes. While providing aid to those experiencing food insecurity may require inconvenience or personal forfeiture, to ignore the plight of another is morally reprehensible, according to Singer. In contrast, ethicist Robert Nozick could suggest that obliging one nation to relinquish valuable resources for the benefit of another would require a reduction of freedom and be a flagrant violation of the rights of the wealthy nation. Nozick contends that any obligatory redistribution of resources is a serious matter that necessitates a violation of the giver's rights and freedoms. Discussions regarding the moral obligations of others to ensure the protection of the right to food are vast. However, these discussions become even more complex once one considers the influence of climate change on enhancing global food insecurity. According to the New York Times, although accounting for 12% of the global population, 23 of the world's wealthiest countries are responsible for over half of all historic carbon dioxide emissions. Ironically, these primary contributors to global warming will witness the least of its effects, and nations that have contributed the least to climate change will suffer the worst consequences, especially in regard to food insecurity. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, wealthy nations have derived extensive economic benefits from the disproportionate emissions of greenhouse gases, at the expense of the global South, who will unjustly endure the detrimental effects of global warming. The Rawlsian veil of ignorance is applicable in assessing the social and economic responsibility of developed, high greenhouse gas emitting nations in attempting rectification for damages incurred as a result of climate change. The veil of ignorance is a hypothetical state in which decisions regarding social justice are made fairly, as if by a person who must decide on society's rules and economic structures without knowing what position he or she will occupy in that society. Under such a veil, Rawls argues that parties would make decisions that maximize basic liberties and fail equality of opportunity, only allowing for inequalities that serve to elevate the position of the worst off. In applying the veil of ignorance device on the international scale, one would reason that nations should make decisions regarding responsibility in addressing the problems of climate change as if they didn't have access to irrelevant biasing information, such as their own economic state, emissions contribution, or geographic location. Deprived of knowledge of personal characteristics, parties will pursue policy that results in the maximization of justice. From a Rawlsian perspective under the veil, nations would concur that high-income states have a moral obligation to both provide assistance to disadvantaged states and take measures to mitigate emissions, especially considering the inordinate level at which wealthy nations are responsible for climate change and its subsequent effects. Such policies would require the imposition of increased financial burden upon developed countries. However, these inequalities would serve the interests of those nations most harmed by climate change. The effects of climate change amplify the moral obligation that a capable country has in providing relief to those experiencing food insecurity. Greater contribution to the problem increases moral culpability for the damaging effects that the problem has on other nations. Through high rates of greenhouse gas emissions, wealthy nations exorbitantly advance climate change, which disproportionately disturbs the agricultural functions of low-income countries, resulting in intensified food insecurity. Thus, the development of strategies for rectification of the impact of climate change and its influence on food insecurity specifically should be a global imperative amongst the developed world. Conclusion. While some may argue that there are more pressing issues related to poverty and inequality than climate change and food insecurity, this relationship is and will continue to increasingly aggravate existing global inequities. The effects of climate change on food are extensive and will be catastrophic. As climate change continues to progress, the world can expect drastic limitations on food availability and access, decreases in nutritious quality of food, rapidly increasing rates of global food insecurity and hunger, the deprivation of income amongst food suppliers, and the collapse of entire economies that rely on food systems as their principal industry. Most significantly, these effects will be disproportionately and unjustly encountered by nations with existing high rates of food insecurity, despite their minimal contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, the primary source of climate change. From now on, policies and programs aimed at addressing global food insecurity must consider the manner in which the frequency and severity of food insecurity are amplified by the detrimental effects of climate change. Climate change has the potential to diminish the work of decades of anti-poverty measures taken to address international inequalities. And if one wishes to design methods of providing relief to those experiencing food insecurity, they may want to begin by developing strategies to increase the resilience and limit the effects of climate change. The future of the security of global food systems is dependent upon climate, and as this climate becomes increasingly disruptive, the world can expect disastrous impacts on international access to food.